Hey everybody, it's Tom coming to you today from the beautiful frozen frontier because EMS people, we need to talk. Over the last few weeks, I've seen a disturbing amount of misinformation and myth about COVID 19 and its vaccines being circulated on social media by EMTs and paramedics, and it's making us all look bad. These are all tweets and comments from posts on EMS social media. Bruh, we have to do better. Everyone I know who works in this profession gets angry and frustrated that we don't have the same respect and pay parity as other healthcare providers. But as they say, everyone wants to be respected as a healthcare provider until it comes time to do respected healthcare provider shit. Which, in this case, really only consists of understanding and acknowledging vaccine science and evidence based medicine, so it's really not that hard. Alright. Well, it wouldn't be right to complain about so many of my brethren pushing misinformation unless I tried to do something about it. So this brings us to my spontaneous, unsolicited, and completely unsanctioned talk, Dr. Facebook, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Vaccine. Before we get started, the requisite disclosure statement. I have no disclosures. I promise that I am not on the payroll of any pharmaceutical company. I kind of wish I was, because I wouldn't be working for a living. Also, I've received nothing for preparing or recording this talk, though in the off chance that you're watching this and happen to be on the admissions committee of a certain PA school. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started. First, what's the state of play when it comes to COVID-19? So obviously these numbers are a moving target, but as of this recording on January 2nd, 2021, we're sitting at over 84 million cases worldwide and just over 1.8 million deaths. Here in the US, we're at 20.2 million cases and over 348,000 deaths. Now let's take a second to put these numbers into perspective. This is absolutely insane. The US represents about 4.5% of the world's population, but we've clocked almost a quarter of the total COVID-19 cases worldwide. More than 1 out of 1,000 Americans has died as a result of COVID-19. This is equivalent to killing off the populations of Anaheim or Pittsburgh or St. Paul. That's absolutely terrifying when you put it in context. We currently have 2 vaccines that are now being distributed nationwide, one from Pfizer-BioNTech and one from Moderna. These are both being administered under emergency use authorizations from the FDA, and they both use very similar mRNA technology, which is the whole reason why we're here. Now, for us to get into why these vaccines are safe and why you should elect to take it, we need to do a super quick, super high-level review of the basic biochemical concepts behind how they work. Now look, I know that I didn't get a hell of a lot of instruction when it comes to immunology or biochemistry or anything really related to how all this works in paramedic school. I didn't have a prayer of beginning to really get it until I went to college as a science major, so do not feel bad if this is the first time you're hearing any of this. It's not your fault. It should, however, show you why there really is a dire need to increase the educational requirements for pre-hospital clinicians, particularly paramedics. All right, first, everybody knows what DNA is. If you were like me and were an adolescent when the first Jurassic Park movie came out, you probably knew more about DNA than any 11-year-old should. But for review, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is that funky double helix molecule that contains all of our encoded genetic information. It consists of a sugar backbone, the deoxyribose, and a very long series of base pairs that are made up of 4 amino acids or nucleotides: adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. That double helix structure and its chemical composition make it a very stable, fairly resilient molecule, which is important since it contains the user's manual for all of the stuff that keeps us alive and makes us who we are. RNA, on the other hand, is a single-stranded molecule with a different sugar as its backbone. Ribose, instead of deoxyribose, hence the name RNA versus DNA. The nucleotides are the same, except that thymine in DNA is replaced with uracil in RNA. Now, the structural differences make RNA much more fragile and easily degraded, which is going to come into play later, so remember this. The big concept that you need to remember is known in genetics and biochemistry as the central dogma. Now, this just describes how our genetic information is used to make the proteins that are essential to human metabolism. Again, that's stuff that keeps us alive and kicking. So, DNA hangs out in the nucleus of our cells where it's pretty protected. This is going to come into play later, so remember that too. When the genetic information contained in the DNA needs to be used, it undergoes a process called transcription. Now, there are some enzymes called polymerases that split the DNA double helix and make a copy of one half of it. This ends up becoming RNA, or more specifically, messenger RNA or mRNA. This is what these vaccines use to induce an immune response from your body. Now, that mRNA gets transported out of the nucleus, where it eventually hooks up with the ribosomes. The ribosomes then run that strand of RNA during a process called translation. This is where it collects the sequence of amino acids that are laid out in the RNA. Now, these amino acids are bound in series called polypeptides, and eventually they interact and bond with one another, folding into our good friends, proteins. Now, proteins are really cool and really important. They carry out lots of different functions. They transport materials into, out of, and around cells. They communicate and signal to other cells. They act as enzymes, catalyzing various reactions, lots of different stuff. And I can't remember which coagulation factor this is, but I just thought it was a really beautiful rendering that shows how complex proteins can be. Okay, so now what you really just need to remember is this. DNA goes through transcription to mRNA, which is then translated into proteins. That's it. That's the central dogma. Now, this is important for this discussion because of this little bastard. This is a rendering of the spike protein that's found on the surface of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. This is a complex protein that's encoded within the virus's genome and interacts with the cells that it's trying to invade. So here's that spike protein on the surface of the virus. It binds to ACE2, angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptors that are found in many different cells, but are plentiful in the epithelial cells of your mucous membranes, hence why this is so transmissible through inhaled droplets and aerosols. This is why you, and just about everyone else, should be wearing a mask when around other people. Wear a mask. Okay, so this is all well and good, but why should you care, and why do you need to know this? Meet your two best friends that will help bring an end to the pandemic. On the left, we have a macrophage, and on the right, we have a dendritic cell. Now, these guys are heavy hitters when it comes to presenting antigens to foreign invaders and are the targets of the mRNA vaccines that we're talking about. This is a lipid nanoparticle. Basically, this is a very well-engineered, very small ball of lipids that protect and transport little itty-bitty bits of mRNA, really a piece of the virus's genome. In this case, the part that encodes the spike protein that we just talked about. Remember how we talked about how fragile the mRNA is? It degrades very quickly inside the body. Now, those lipid nanoparticles protect the mRNA as it makes its way to the macrophages and dendritic cells in the lymph node near where the vaccine's injected. And once it gets there, it facilitates moving across the cell membrane and into the intracellular space where it can work its magic. Now, the environment inside the cell is different than outside. When these lipid nanoparticles encounter this new environment, they start to break apart, which releases the mRNA, which makes its way to the ribosome, which encodes that particular protein, which lets the immune cells know what they're looking for and if the whole SARS-CoV-2 virus ends up in your body. Think of it like the cops having a picture of a suspect before the crime is committed, so they can nip it in the bud before things get out of hand. Now, that's a very simplified version of what happens. I mean, there are incredibly complex pathways associated with antigen presentation that I am not cool enough to understand the details of. I mean, there are whole doctoral programs where you just study immunology completed by people who are much smarter than I am. But this is the gist of how and why these vaccines work. Now that we know how and why they work, we really need to talk about some of the myths that have been circulating and finally put them to bed. Myth 1. The vaccine was developed in less than a year. Fun fact, it was not. Now, this here is the kind of nonsense that is being posted by EMS providers for everyone in the world to see. Yes, John, I am calling you out personally. You and everyone else who posts stuff like this are representing our profession to the world. You are making us look bad. Stop. Do better. Now, meet Dr. Katalin Kariko, Hungarian immigrant and biochemical rock star. All the way back in 1990, she submitted her first grant application at the University of Pennsylvania to start exploring using mRNA to induce an immune response. Now, going was slow, and academia being what it is, she ended up getting a lot of flack for refusing to give up on the idea, ended up being demoted as a professor and just generally treated like crap. But she persisted and laid the groundwork for the vaccines that are going to help bring this nightmare to an end. This guy, Dr. Drew Weissman, is an immunologist that joined her at UPenn, said, "Yep, this is a good idea," joined her research, and together in 2005, they published a paper that demonstrated how they solved the problems that had been encountered in delivering mRNA as a vaccine, again laying the groundwork for what was to come. So no, this didn't happen in a year. This process started before some of you watching this were even born. The technology has been developing and maturing since the early 1990s, and while this pandemic and its effects have been absolutely horrible, one good thing has come of it. It's shown what our scientific community can do when enough resources and money are provided, and that it can be done safely. Okay, next myth. We know nothing about the safety of these vaccines. Reality, we do. All right, we'll start with the Pfizer vaccine. The combined phase 2 and 3 trials started in July of this year. This is an ongoing, blinded, placebo-controlled trial that enrolled a little over 43,000 participants. So this is among some of the highest quality evidence you can get in medicine. It was found to be about 95% effective in preventing COVID-19, and the safety data is excellent. There is no significant difference in adverse events between participants who received the vaccine and those who received a placebo. And in fact, there were more life-threatening events and deaths in participants who received a placebo. If you're interested in looking at the data for yourself, the citation's at the bottom. With the Moderna vaccine, it was a similar trial, also blinded and controlled, also began in July. It enrolled a little over 30,000 participants and was found to be about 94% effective. The safety data is just as promising, with no statistically significant difference in adverse events between the vaccine and placebo arms. So, what does all this mean? It means that since July, more than 70,000 people participated in vaccine trials, and no significant risk of serious injury or death was found. None. Nada. Zip. These vaccines have been studied, and they're continuing to be studied, and they are safe to take. Myth 3. Because the vaccine uses mRNA, it will alter your genetic makeup. No, these vaccines do not and cannot alter your DNA, and here's why. Your DNA hangs out in the nucleus of your cells. That nucleus, in this context, is a one-way street. The mRNA that you transcribe yourself can leave so it can hook up with the ribosomes and make proteins, but it can't really go back home to the nucleus. Once the ribosomes are done with it, it breaks down into its constituent parts, and those get recycled to make new mRNA later. Now, the same thing happens with the mRNA that's introduced through the vaccine. Once it's been translated into a protein, it too breaks down into its constituent parts, and later on ends up becoming a different piece of mRNA that encodes a different protein at a different time. It doesn't interact with your DNA. enter the nucleus. It doesn't alter your genome. It can't do that. Myth 4. You can develop COVID-19 from the vaccines. You cannot develop COVID-19 from the vaccines. It is physiologically impossible. Like we said before, the mRNA in the vaccine is a small piece of the virus's genome that only codes for that one specific protein. So what you're essentially doing is taking the virus, you're cutting out this little part and throwing the rest away. There's no way that this protein can then turn around and become the virus that it came from. It'd be like cutting off your hand and expecting another entire body to grow from it. It just doesn't happen. I mean, at least not with humans. Myth 5. The vaccines are made using fetal cell cultures. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who have religious objections to the use of fetal cell lines in therapeutics and vaccines. That is another discussion for another time. What I will say is that these vaccines do not use fetal cells. I don't have a fancy graphic to show for this, but no live virus is grown, no live cells are used at all. They're not there. Finally, I can't believe that I'm having to even say this, but this is an imperfect world, and I do. So no, these vaccines do not contain government tracking microchips. I mean, I can barely keep my cell phone's battery from dying before the end of the day, and I mean, you think that we have the technology for a nanoscale power supply that could actively power a chip that transmits data wirelessly to a network that exists throughout the entire world? Come on, guys. All right, so that's all I have. Now look, I know that these are scary times. We're all exhausted. We've all been betrayed with how the pandemic has been handled at the highest levels. We're being inundated with information that makes it hard to discern truth from fiction. And it's easy to be distrustful of a medical technology that we haven't heard of before and don't completely understand. I get it. What I can tell you is this. The vaccines are safe. They work. I myself have gotten the first dose, and aside from a bit of fatigue and some arm pain, I seem to be doing just fine. Now, it's our job as healthcare providers to make sure that we are able to keep ourselves in the fight for our patients, for our families, and for ourselves. It's also our job to lead by example, to show people that we understand the science, that we trust it, and that everyone else should too. There's no one else to do it. So please, when it's offered to you, get vaccinated. I hope that this was good information for everyone. If I got anything wrong, which I probably did, please let me know in the comments. If you don't have anything constructive to say, please do not leave it in the comments. I hope you all stay happy and healthy into the new year, and that we can get back to some semblance of normalcy soon. Be well, be safe, wear a mask, and wash your hands.